For 11 seasons, MAS*H felt like a family. Behind the camera, though, it was something closer to a workplace, full of ambition, exhaustion, contracts, and the ordinary human friction that comes from spending years together under pressure. Loretta Swit, who played Major Margaret Hot Lips Houlihan from the very first episode to the very last, watched almost every major departure happen in real time. She was one of only 4 actors who stayed for the entire run, and by the time she passed away on May 30th, 2025, at her home in New York City at the age of 87, she had spent decades reflecting, in interviews, retrospectives, and documentaries, on why so many of her castmates walked away from one of the most successful shows in television history. None of it was a secret confession delivered in her final days. It was scattered across a lifetime of candid conversations, and pieced together, it tells a story far more interesting than any rumor. MAS*H premiered on September 17, 1972, adapted from a 1970 Robert Altman film, which was itself based on Richard Hooker's 1968 novel about army surgeons during the Korean War. What started as a broad-service comedy slowly transformed into something rarer, a series willing to sit with grief, exhaustion, and moral ambiguity in the same episode that made you laugh. That transformation didn't happen by accident, and it didn't happen without cost. As the show evolved, so did the demands placed on its actors, and one by one, several of the original cast decided the price of staying had gotten too high, for reasons that had almost nothing to do with each other, and almost nothing to do with the tabloid-style feuds that fans have speculated about for 50 years. Loretta Swit was there for all of it. Born Loretta Jane Swed on November 4, 1937, in Passaic, New Jersey, to Polish immigrant parents, she trained at the American Academy of Dramatic Arts and spent years touring in regional theater before television offered her a way in, with guest spots on shows like Gunsmoke and Hawaii Five-0 in the late 1960s. When she was cast as Margaret Houlihan in 1972, nobody, including Swit, expected the role to define the next decade of her life. The character began as little more than a rigid, one-note foil, defined mostly by her secret affair with the pompous Major Frank Burns. Over the years, Swit pushed the writers to let Margaret grow into a fuller, more competent, more compassionate person. It worked. She earned 10 Emmy nominations for the role and won twice, in 1980 and 1982, along with 4 Golden Globe nominations. She was one of only 2 actors, alongside Alan Alda, to appear in both the pilot and the record-breaking series finale. The first major departure came at the end of Season 3, when McLean Stevenson's Lieutenant Colonel Henry Blake was killed off in the devastating finale Abyssinia, Henry. For years, fans assumed some kind of on-set conflict drove Stevenson away. The truth, which he confirmed himself in a 1991 interview with the Los Angeles Times, was blunter: money. "I left the show because of money," he admitted. "Every time CBS gave me an offer, NBC would double it." NBC was courting him aggressively, dangling the possibility that he could eventually inherit Johnny Carson's Tonight Show chair and offering him his own sitcom in the meantime. But money wasn't the whole picture. Stevenson had also grown frustrated that, in an ensemble built around Alan Alda's increasingly central Hawkeye Pierce, his own storylines were often trimmed first when an episode ran long, and he felt genuinely underappreciated compared to the attention Alda received. He was also unhappy with what he saw as the production company's disregard for basic comforts for the cast and crew on location. Loretta Swit, who knew him well, later recalled that Stevenson wanted to be a star in his own right rather than one voice in an ensemble of 8, and that he told her directly, before he left, that he knew he'd never work with a cast or scripts as good as MASH's again, but that he had to leave and try to become number one. He turned out to be wrong about the bet. His NBC vehicles, including the on-the-nose titled The McLean Stevenson Show, were canceled quickly, and he later admitted the decision to leave MASH was the biggest mistake of his career, saying he had mistakenly believed everybody in America loved McLean Stevenson, when in fact, as he put it, everybody loved Henry Blake. Wayne Rogers left at almost exactly the same time as Stevenson, and his exit was, in its own way, even stranger. When Rogers signed on to play Trapper John McIntyre, he understood the role to be a true co-lead alongside Aldous Hawkeye. As the series found its footing, the writers increasingly built episodes around Hawkeye, and Trapper John's screen time and story weight shrank in comparison. Rogers felt the imbalance keenly, and though he genuinely liked Alda and never blamed him personally, he didn't want to spend years playing what was becoming, in his eyes, a psychic role. What made his departure especially unusual was the way he was able to walk away without a legal fight. When Rogers was first cast, the studio presented him with a standard contract that included a broad morals clause, allowing the network to fire him for behavior it deemed objectionable. Rogers objected to the vague wording on principle and simply never signed it. Nobody at the studio ever followed up to close the loophole, which meant that when he decided to leave after season 3, he had no binding contract to break. The producers reportedly considered legal action but had no real grounds, since there was no signed agreement to enforce. Rogers left with no fanfare and no announced farewell episode. His character was simply said to have been discharged. He never expressed regret about the decision. In a 1979 interview, when asked whether he had any regrets about leaving, he answered simply that he would have had regrets if he hadn't. Major Frank Burns disappeared after season 5 without an on-screen goodbye, a fact that puzzled audiences for years. Larry Linville had signed an initial 5-year contract, and when the producers offered him a 2-year extension, he turned it down. His reasoning, which he later explained plainly in interviews, was less about conflict and more about creative exhaustion. Frank Burns had been written as a fairly one-dimensional antagonist, petty, cowardly, and comically inept, and as the show matured into something more emotionally complex, Linville felt his character simply hadn't been given room to grow the way Margaret, Hawkeye, and others had. "I guess I was just tired of being the guy you love to loathe," he said in a later interview. By then, my involvement with Major Frank Burns had run its course. It was time to move on. He also acknowledged that the timing coincided with a difficult period in his personal life, including a divorce, which made him even less inclined to return for a proper send-off episode when producers asked. The writers ultimately explained Frank's absence off-screen. He was said to have gone soul-searching for Margaret during her honeymoon, suffered a breakdown, and been reassigned stateside. Even series creator Larry Gelbart later said he wished the character had been written with a bit more nuance from the start. Linville's exit wasn't a rupture. It was an actor who felt he'd said everything the role had to offer, choosing to move on before the audience noticed the character had stopped evolving. Radar O'Reilly's departure in Season 8 is the one that plays out on screen with the most emotional weight, and it reflected genuine turmoil in Gary Burghoff's life at the time. Burghoff was the only actor to carry his role over from the original 1970 film, and by the time he left the series, he had played the character for roughly a decade between film and television. He has said repeatedly, across interviews spanning decades, that his decision came down to burnout and need to refocus on his family rather than any dispute over money or billing. "My life at that time, it was a beautiful picture that was all crooked, and I had to step back big time in order to grow as a human being," he explained in a 2024 documentary about the show. He was careful to frame it as a natural conclusion rather than a walkout. His 7-year contract had simply expired, and he chose not to renegotiate because he was already pulling back from nearly every commitment in his life. Colleagues who worked closely with him pointed to additional strain. Director Charles S. Dubin recalled that Burghoff was going through serious difficulties in his marriage during his final seasons on the show, and that filming his character's teary farewell scenes became genuinely difficult for him emotionally. Burghoff has also spoken about feeling that, despite Radar's popularity with audiences, he didn't always feel he was getting his creative due within the production. None of this was contract-driven the way Stevenson's or Linville's exits partly were. By most accounts, including that of executive producer Burt Metcalf, Burghoff wasn't chasing a bigger paycheck or a bigger role elsewhere. He simply reached a point where continuing to play Radar was in direct conflict with the rest of his life, and he chose his family and his own well-being over the show. Amid all of this turnover, Swit remained a constant, and much of the credit for Margaret Houlihan's evolution from stereotype to fully realized character belongs to her. She pushed writers for better material and drew on research into real military nurses to make the role feel authentic, and Alan Alda later credited her publicly for turning a one-joke sexist stereotype into a real person, with real feelings and ambitions. Recalling that the writing staff eventually celebrated the day, a script referred to her simply as Margaret instead of Hot Lips. Off-screen, Swit's working relationship with Larry Linville was, by most accounts from both of them, professional rather than personal. In joint interviews over the years, both actors spoke about the craft of playing characters who clashed on screen while maintaining mutual respect off it, and neither publicly described any lasting feud. Swit was closest, by her own account and others, to Alda and to Jamie Farr, who played Corporal Klinger and later said of her, "I dearly loved Loretta, as close as family can get." Swit's life outside MAS** had its own share of difficulty. In 1983, shortly after the series ended, she married actor Dennis Holohan, who had appeared in the final season. The marriage ended in divorce 3 years later, in 1986, and she did not remarry. She poured much of her later energy into animal welfare, becoming a vegetarian in 1981 and later adopting veganism, hosting the Discovery series Those Incredible Animals for 5 years, and publishing a book in 2017 that combined her watercolor art with essays on animal activism. She continued that advocacy quietly for the rest of her life. When she died on May 30th, 2025, her representatives said the cause was believed to be natural causes, and tributes poured in from former castmates, with Alda writing that she had deserved all her 10 Emmy nominations and her 2 wins, and that more than acting her part, she created it. It's easy to see why fans have spent decades assuming something darker was behind these departures. A hit show losing 4 major cast members within its first 8 seasons does sound, on its surface, like a story of internal conflict. But the documented record, built from decades of interviews with the actors themselves, tells a far more human story. A network bidding war for Stevenson. A young actor's principled refusal to sign a vague contract clause for Rogers. Creative exhaustion after 5 years playing the same one-note villain for Linville, and burnout colliding with a strained marriage for Burghoff. What kept Loretta Swit on set for all 11 seasons, by her own account and those who worked with her, was the same thing that made Margaret Houlihan's transformation possible in the first place. A willingness to keep pushing to make the work better, season after season, rather than walk away from it.